Imagine that everything that you've been taught is a lie. And I'm not saying that it is, but let's do a little thought experiment. And I guarantee you that for 99% of the people out there, there will be a new idea in here that you haven't connected. Let's say that you're in middle school and you're learning geography, and you're told that you live in the United States of America, and you memorize all of the continents, all of the oceans, all of the countries, and you learn about the wars and dates and these factual things that nobody questions, that you're tested on, and that you have to get right in order to advance to the next level. Meaning there is no debate. There is no discussion. You learn what is given to you. And because you live in a society where this is normal, there is not a second thought about it. You live in the United States of America. World War II happened. This time, these are the winners, these are the losers, these are the bad guys, and so on and so forth. And this level of indoctrination becomes familiar with you. So when you are presented with facts and evidence and things that are presumably non-debatable, you just let them go. You let any sort of questions about it go. I remember watching a TikTok from a soldier who went to the Vietnam War, who experienced this exact phenomenon, where when he was enlisting, he was signing up to be the good guy, and he was sold a story, as was being portrayed in the media at the time, that he was going to be this great freer, this democracy beacon that was going to save women and children and villagers from this evil threat. And he was surprised, because when he got there, he very quickly figured out that the village people who he was expecting to be lauded as a hero looked at him with disdain, almost as though he was the villain. And something frightening would happen to him, where the very people that he signed up to save, he started seeing as the enemy and started seeing as the other. And he was tasked with doing things that he wasn't quite expecting. He quickly figured out that what was being portrayed in magazines and the news back home was very different from what he was actually doing. There would be this self-preservation that kicked in, and this concern for his life. His friends would be blown apart, and he would wonder why he was really there. There would be other questions about other wars, but usually these questions were not presented in mainstream media. And what would be presented would be things like terrorism and threats to democracy and saving people. And then we would later suspect. These are all rumors, of course, speculation, but verifiable data and evidence to back this up. I have physically seen some of these documents in the Freedom of Information Act for the MK Ultra, where the CIA at that time, around the Vietnam War, was very concerned about the Golden Triangle and the opium and the poppy fields there, and conducted numerous surveys and spent quite a bit of money and investment in collecting information, and almost seemed perplexed that that side of the world did not, quote, exploit their resources. Almost as though they were like, this is for the taking. That's my impression. These are dry documents, very not colorful, but exploit, and was definitely in there. And the feeling that there was surprise that the rest of the world had access to these amazing resources that were just sitting there untapped. But that's me putting a layer of interpretation over it and looking at the whole picture. Later on, there would be questions about the poppy production or opium production in Afghanistan and questions surrounding that war. And there would be reports from soldiers that would say that their job was actually to guard these fields, poppy fields. And back at home, of course, the narrative, the factual narrative of the good guys and the bad guys would be perhaps, again, thought experiment, warped to portray a particular flavor of one side, to rouse the masses to their consent and their agreement. Now we would also find out that perhaps, again, speculative, even though there are data to reflect this, that there are some questions surrounding the Ukrainian war, leading us to wonder why we are perpetually going in with a potential, again, if it's true, cover story, only to find ourselves there for perhaps exploitative reasons. Now let's go back to something that I mentioned in the previous episode, where John Ramirez, retired CIA, was talking to a UFO disclosure podcaster, and they were having a conversation, and John Ramirez was saying, I physically went to a meeting where I was told point blank that the human genome had been manipulated, or no, sorry, enhanced. He was very particular about that there had been enhancements to our DNA, and that this was known in some circles, but not others. And now let's imagine for a moment that you're back in middle school and you're learning about the human body, perhaps even high school, and you're learning about genetics and the five senses, and you're never told about this enhancement. Instead, you're given a biology book. That biology book omits certain details, like extrasensory perceptual abilities, which are a known, valid, researched thing in underground publications, or in not even underground publications per se, but in away from the mainstream. Let's put it that way. And let's imagine that you are receiving this information and you're none the wiser. Just like the dates and the wars and the good guys and the bad guys and the country that you live in and the countries that other people live in and the timelines and all of that, you just accept point blank. You just accept, this is my body, this is what it does. And let's also say that another point that came up in the John Ramirez interview was that everything that we learned in school was a lie. And let's just hold that for a moment and take it at face value and continue exploring what that might possibly mean. But now I'd like to direct your attention to a different exhibit. Dr. Stephen Greer has been noted in an interview of saying something very particular, very strange to me, which is, first of all, the background for this. He believes that there is a series of, I believe it was 13 elite families that are, quote unquote, ruling the world, and that there is pretty strong evidence that there's this entire other arm of the military. It's like a secret arm of the military that even our best military people don't know about. And this is where very, very heavy duty research goes on, like 10 to 20 year advances in physics that have just been black boxed and shelved away from the mainstream. Biology, as well as material sciences and things pertaining to non-human intelligences. And that the capabilities of this arm of the military far exceed anything that anybody knows. Like they had iPhones, I believe, when cell phones were barely coming out, just to give you a perspective of that difference. And they have technology and reach that we wouldn't even be able to conceive of. So imagine the power of the AI that they are potentially using. And as I like to believe, other worlds. But we'll get there. Not in this episode. We'll get there. And so Dr. Stephen Greer has spent the last, I believe it's 20 to 30 years compiling evidence of non-human intelligences, downed craft, all sorts of black budget projects and illegal activity, things pertaining to human trafficking, some pretty heavy stuff. He, in an interview, says this core group of people that are pulling the strings, there's some of them, and he doesn't say who, he doesn't say how many, but he just says that there are some of them which are religious fanatics and want to bring in Armageddon so they can bring back Christ. I've seen the interview a couple times, and I just recently was refreshed on it, but with different eyes. And so now, let's imagine that those people that want to bring in this Armageddon, and let's just say it's true, and that Dr. Stephen Greer is representing the truth accurately. What if even they don't know that what they were given was a lie? Because how far does it go back? And obviously, there are lies upon lies upon lies if we believe that this thought experiment has any credibility. And so it's like a nesting doll of lies, and the origin, source of those lies could be different. But at what point were they in middle school given a map and told, you live in the United States, here is China, here is the Soviet Union, here are the communists, the bad guys, so on and so forth, right? And at what point, when we look at the timelines, because there are some rumors and some speculative arguments that the very notion of what year we're in may be completely off by like 1,000 years. Some say, I don't know if there's any credence to that. I'm just relaying what I have heard other people speculate on. And that there are civilizations that have been covered up along the way. And collapses and resets in society that are just kind of hand-waved away. Yep, it's just another Chicago fire. It's just another Maui fire. It's just another fire. It's just another maelstrom of events. It's another cataclysm, great flood, mud flood. Noah's got to build another ark. Sorry. Yeah, oh, we're not in that time frame anymore. Somebody else has got to build it. Elon, how's that trip to Mars going? And so as a result, we have to ask ourselves with all seriousness, if all of these data points are true, and if John Ramirez said what I thought he said, which was that our genome could have been first manipulated like 65,000 years ago, and perhaps subsequently manipulated, do the people that are trying to bring in the Armageddon know this? Do they know that they are hybrids? Do they believe in the fidelity of the manuscript that they were given, that they're basing their Armageddon on? That's my point. Because if somebody had the foresight to enhance our genome that long ago, why would we believe in the veracity of the documents and the publications then, which predated all of these contemporary wars? And why would anybody hold any sort of accountability to a figure or any sort of operating entity that was actually designed, perhaps, to cover up the fact of where the actual origin of the human species came from? So imagine for a moment that people are trying to bring in the Armageddon, and they're doing so because they read a story in a book. And that story in the book they took to be truth. Just like they took their body and what they learned to be truth, even though they would go on to distort truth as we know it, thereby actually executing the same type of actions that others imposed upon them. But then to bring in something like the end of the world, because they cherry-picked one truth to believe in and impose an enormous amount of suffering. By the way, I don't know about you, but I'm not up for living through another Armageddon. They're pretty grim, I have to be honest. And of course, in this human life, I've only been around for some number of decades, middle age-ish, depending on the metrics that you're looking at. The expected life expectancy is really shifting. So, because we're killing off our species, a whole host of issues to talk about it in other episodes, but our survival is not going up, is the point. And I'm personally okay with it, seeing how things are unfolding. I'm not sad about it. I don't want to live forever in a place that can't pick up its own trash. It's just put it in our rivers, pollute the oceans and our water supply. And, you know, my brain is, and your brain is somewhat like 5% microplastics by now, and all sorts of pollutants going through our body. So I'm not unhappy about getting cancer and peacing out early. But in other lifetimes, I have experienced Armageddon, and it's brutal. It's a pretty nasty experience. So imagine being so indoctrinated with this concept of truth that you then impose that fanaticism not on just one population, your own population, but on the earth. Well, what you think is the earth, because that's what you told. That's what somebody told you. It's like, you live on planet Earth, and planet Earth is a planet in the solar system. And when I was learning all that, there was only one, one habitable planet, one solar system. And turns out there are many. It's kind of crazy. So anyway, the point is you're told where you are living. And you're told about the nature of things and who came before you. And if you believe it to be true, and then you enact these things like revenge, that's a great one, or nonsense in some cases, then what does that really say about your capacity to lead? And how do we come to these decisions about who should be leading our species, and actually multiple species? Because if we could be so easily tricked into just believing that there's one reality, for example, because we only see just the smallest little fraction of the spectrum of light. It's wild when you think about it. We only see like a little tiny sliver of actual reality, but our emboldened egoic nature will say, that's it. I'm willing to die for it. We will feel that way with such passion and intensity that our way of perceiving things is absolutely correct, even though logically we know that there's only a small, tiny, little, tiny sliver that we're actually perceiving. And that's actually contingent upon our inputs and our processing abilities. And I happen to believe that we are low tech. I'm just saying. I know relative to other species, it looks like we're high tech, but I actually get the sense that we're pretty low tech. So imagine a species like that getting so riled up because you can tell them a story, and the manner in which you give them that story, they believe that it's true, and they don't know another story, and they don't spend a lot of time questioning it. So they literally start wars and burn down cultures and species level extinction events they purposefully try to bring in order to bring in a guy. Oh, he's not just a guy. You know, he's an amazing guy, of course. But did you know that, this is a crazy fact, that the people that built our society, when you look at their IQ scores, they would be considered, the brightest at that time would be considered mentally challenged today, or just average. They would just be average Joes, because our intelligence grew so much just since the Industrial Revolution and since the early 1900s. And now let's go all the way back to when this Christ fella was around. And the population then. And let's think about the probable level of their IQ scores. Let's think about this for a moment. And so we want to bring back somebody from that time period to do miracles for us. It turns out we can do miracles now. And I'm pretty sure that the upper echelon knows that, because that's why they have everything in the secret teaching. So they don't need anybody to come back and do miracles and turn water into wine or to make, you know, a mountain of shit into wealth, or to cause a society to toil and labor itself to death so they can loosh themselves in the bathtub. I don't know why, but assuming that this is true, now I'd like to ask you something else. Why do you think there is such a predominant narrative about transhumanism? I bring this up because I'm really surprised. And here's why. It seems as though there's this big push to create conversation about why transhumanism is frightening and why it's terrifying. And there's not really alternatives. This channel is an alternative to that. But it's not well received yet. And I'm still talking to a few of you. Thank you for being here and for gratiating me with your presence. But I lose listeners every time I talk about this, and ChatGPT advised me to start a different channel. And because my core listeners are clearly not aligned with this direction. I'm considering that, but for now, I'm here. I find it interesting because there's so much resistance to it. And if, let's just say, evil people in charge, if they are evil, and if they are actually in charge, the evil ones at least, let's just say for a moment that they are the ones that are bringing in this wave of transhumanism. Are they also the ones that are suppressing the new technologies in physics, chemistry, material science? Because that's been going on for a really long time. For a very long time. In fact, there's been a domination of the power grid, coal, dirty energy, gasoline, and old tech, infrastructure that is really old. And now we have this, quote, wave of technological revolution, except the people that are apparently holding everything are still not okay with talking about free energy, revolutionizing what we would need to in order to bring in these 15-minute cities, right? And that level of integration and supporting AI. And when we look at what else is being suppressed, what we find, and you kind of have to be in the know about this because they're so suppressed that they are on the fringe. We have real doctors and real scientists that are publishing actual scientific results and papers, not in credible journals because they're banned and barred, but I've looked through their presentations. They're doing actual scientific experiments that, as a trained scientist, I believe have validity. Most of them are still pilot studies because they're underpowered and underfunded. No surprise, because they're alienated. They are demonstrating quite convincingly that some of our vaccines and medicines actually have self-assembling nanotechnology. And it's amazing, actually, when you look at their presentation, because it's hard to interpret it as anything other than really sophisticated biotech. But they are silenced. Silenced. To me, especially in light of what has happened with the silencing of vaccine critics along the way, and it turns out, oh, oops, yep, the Yale just published a really important study. Yale Medical School shows that, yeah, that mRNA vaccine, yeah, those doctors that we suppressed along the way, they were right. Yep, that we deplatformed and all of that. Yep, that was all true. That was all true. Oops, our bad. But really glad that Big Pharma has those liability protections that they did with Reagan, so they can't really be held liable because they figured out a long time ago that apparently vaccines were decidedly unsafe. And so they went to Reagan and said, we're not going to do this anymore. This is from R.F. Kennedy telling this story. They said, we're not going to do this anymore. And they were like, well, let's just put in this clause here so you're not going to be liable. And everything's going to be good. And also on the suppressed list are those that try to communicate about advancements in human technology. And they try to talk about their experiences. You can look up Targeted Justice. There's a whole organization of individuals that claim that they are being remotely accessed in ways that the biology books in middle school would have us believe are just simply not possible. But when you go and look at the US patent database, you see years of evidence where, in fact, it is not only possible, but quite feasible. And you don't even need an entirely new military arm to do it. We can do it in today's technology with EMF and other fields. So imagine for a moment that those who try to talk about their experiences and bring this information to light don't have a leg to stand on in the mainstream world. Almost as though there's this hand waving, like in the Vietnam War, when the soldier went over and was surprised by the reception. He was expecting like people to be cheering, like, yes, the white man is here to save us. He's like, they're trying to throw bombs at me. What is going on? You know, like, this is madness. So imagine for a moment that this propaganda machine is selectively narrating stories for us to get us to believe, to consent, or to not consent to certain things. What is interesting to me is that if we connect all of these dots, it seems as though, to me at least, that there's a high probability that transhumanism is already here. It's already here. When you look at the self-assembling nanotechnology that apparently was distributed quite recently, and the fact that humans are emitting MAC addresses when you take them out into the wilderness with no cell phones, no devices, no interfering connections, and you have them walk up to somebody who has a Bluetooth reader. They have no devices on them for a compelling distance. They're in the wilderness. And boop. As soon as they get close to that person that has the Bluetooth scanner, you know what they have? Many people, the majority in that study, were emitting a MAC address. A MAC address is the broadcast identifier for devices that connect online. And it seems as though there are studies that show that humans are capable of being online. They are capable of transmitting data. To where? Well, I don't know. Because the people that are trying to talk about it can't talk about it. And those that talk about maybe something being done like that to them also can't talk about their experience. But you know what we can talk about? Why we should all collectively resist any sort of integration with human technology. By whom? By people like Neuralink, Elon Musk, and others. They don't know what's going on. I guarantee you, they're not the ones that have any idea that they might even be themselves emitting a MAC address. And one of the biggest mysteries to me is, why does it even seem like there's an illusion of choice? And the choice, if it comes, everybody collectively is going to reject and want to stay as their old form. To stay in the dark about perhaps, just perhaps, this is all allegedly, what has already happened to them. And stay ignorant of the capabilities and the potential of what their body might be able to do now. A lot of the tech that has been buried about Stephen Greer's work relates to consciousness modulation, the sheer fact of intention, conscious intent, and thinking about something can drive and activate some of those technical features and some of those craft that have been buried. Imagine for a moment that you thought that to heal yourself, you had to go to Big Pharma. And now imagine that you've been transhuman this entire time with fairly sophisticated advanced technology, where all you had to do was use the power of your mind, your conscious intent, your energy, your frequency, your vibration, which conveniently has also been left out of your educational package in middle school and high school. And now imagine that you actually do have incredible strength and fortitude available to you, only if you knew about it. But because you've been indoctrinated with fear and fear-mongering of what being transhuman is like, I don't want to be a robot, says my grandmother who's no longer with us, Dear Mimi, you don't have to be a robot. You already are. You just don't know it because you're thinking of robotics as you need a metallic arm, and perhaps you're already silicone. And maybe it's not even silicone. Maybe it is some thing that we can't even test for because our instrumentation doesn't recognize that material. Part of me believes that if there was a power structure that wanted people to remain in an M. Night Shyamalan movie, that they would do so by having us adhere to the old systems. And that would be repeating. That would be a theme of suppression that is actually a very powerful tool to keep people exactly where they are, thereby resisting any technological leaps and bounds that would degrid us from the old system. And that's why I wonder why there's so little conversation about the cool parts of being human 2.0 and heavy, heavy indoctrination against perhaps what has already happened to us, not just from this lifetime, but perhaps from 65 to 70,000 years ago. That even those who believe they're in charge, being middle management but not understanding their position in the hierarchy, perhaps even they didn't even realize that they were transhuman the entire time.